The great chamber of the Galactic Conclave stretched upward into darkness, its crystalline walls humming with the voices of 1,000 species who had gathered to decide the fate of worlds. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the center of the speaking platform, her small human form dwarfed by the massive holographic displays that surrounded her on all sides. She had traveled 17 days through hyperspace to reach this place, and she had brought with her the screams of dying worlds. "Honored members of the Conclave," she began, her voice steady despite the weight pressing down upon her heart. "I come before you not with requests, but with evidence of genocide." Behind her, the holographic projectors flickered to life, and suddenly the chamber was filled with images that made even the oldest species look away in horror. New Helsinki burned across the display, its beautiful forests turned to ash, its cities reduced to molten craters where 17 million humans had lived just 3 weeks ago. The Vectory warships hung in orbit like patient predators, their weapons still glowing from the destruction they had unleashed upon a world that had done nothing wrong. The Vectory Dominion has attacked 47 human colonies in the past 6 months. Elena continued, her hands gripping the podium to stop them from shaking. They have killed over 9 billion of our people, and they show no signs of stopping. She looked up at the towering figures of the triumvirate of elders, beings of pure light and ancient thought, who had guided the galaxy toward peace for 6,000 years. The resonance, the oldest of them all, pulsed with soft golden radiance as it considered her words, and Elena felt the touch of its mind brushing against her own. "We have seen your evidence." Ambassador Vasquez, the resonance spoke in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The suffering of your people weighs heavily upon this assembly." Hope flickered in Elena's chest, and she allowed herself to believe for just one moment that help would come, that the great powers of the galaxy would rise up and defend the innocent. But the resonance continued, and its words fell upon her like stones dropping into still water. "However, the Vectory Dominion has presented claims to the Orion Spur that predate human expansion into that region by several centuries." Elena felt the blood drain from her face as she understood what was coming, and she gripped the podium even harder as her legs threatened to give way beneath her. "The Conclave is determined that this is an internal matter between 2 species disputing territorial boundaries," the resonance declared. "We cannot intervene without setting a dangerous precedent." Whispers erupted throughout the chamber as delegates from hundreds of species discussed this verdict, and Elena heard the murmur of agreement spreading through the assembly like poison through water. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice rising despite her training in diplomatic restraint. "They are slaughtering civilians by the billions, and you call this a territorial dispute." The second member of the triumvirate, a being called the Harmony, flickered with pale blue light as it addressed her with what might have been sympathy. Young species often fail to understand the complexities of galactic politics, the Harmony said in a tone that made Elena's fists clench at her sides. "The Vectory are members of this conclave, and they have rights that must be respected." "What about our rights?" Elena demanded, abandoning all pretense of diplomatic calm. "What about the rights of the children burning alive on Kepler's? Hope right now while we stand here and debate." The third elder, known as the Silence, spoke for the first time, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "Humanity is young, barely 3 centuries among the stars, and you have not yet learned that some battles cannot be won." Elena stared at the ancient beings before her, and something inside her shifted like a fault line preparing to break apart. She had come here believing in the promise of galactic civilization, in the idea that the strong would protect the weak, that justice existed beyond the stars, just as humanity had always hoped. Now she understood the truth that lay beneath the pretty words and shining chambers. There was no justice here, only power, and humanity had none. "I understand," she said quietly. And the chamber fell silent as something in her voice made even the oldest beings pause. "Then you accept our verdict?" the resonance asked. And Elena could feel its confusion at her sudden calm. "No," Elena replied. And she straightened her spine as she looked up at the towering elders without fear. "I understand that we were fools to come here seeking help." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small crystal that contained humanity's membership in the Galactic Conclave, the symbol of their place among the stars. "Humanity formally withdraws from this assembly," she declared. And she let the crystal fall from her fingers to shatter against the floor. "We withdraw our petition, our membership, and our faith in your so-called justice." Gasps echoed through the chamber as 1,000 species witnessed something that had not happened in 4,000 years. A species walking away from the conclave was walking away from trade agreements, from technological exchange, from the protection of galactic law itself. "You cannot survive alone against the Dominion," the resonance said. And for the first time, Elena heard uncertainty in its ancient voice. "The Vectri have 4,000 warships, and you have barely 50, Elena smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had nothing left to lose. "We have something better," she said as she turned to walk toward the exit. "We have 8 billion people who just learned that no one is coming to save them." She paused at the threshold and looked back at the assembly one final time. "When humans realize they are alone," she continued, "they do not despair, they do not surrender. They simply decide to handle the problem themselves. And you should pray to whatever gods you worship that we remember who stood aside and watched while our worlds burned." She walked out of the chamber without looking back, and the doors closed behind her with a sound like a coffin sealing shut. The resonance floated in silence for a long moment, processing what had just occurred, and then it spoke words that would echo through history. "What have we done?" it asked. And no one in the chamber had an answer. High above the conclave station, the human diplomatic vessel fired its engines and vanished into hyperspace, carrying Elena Vasquez back toward a species that was about to wake up. And across the galaxy, in the dark spaces between stars, something began to stir. The Vectri had no idea what was coming. None of them did, for humanity had just spoken the words that would change everything. "Fine," they whispered across 1,000 worlds. "We will do it ourselves, and the universe would never be the same again." 6 months had passed since Elena Vasquez walked out of the Galactic Conclave, and the galaxy was beginning to understand that it had made a terrible mistake. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin stood on the observation deck of his new flagship, the Un's Defiance, watching the shipyards of Mars transform before his eyes, where there had once been 3 construction platforms floating in orbit. There were now 47, and each one worked around the clock without rest. Sparks flew in the darkness of space as thousands of workers welded hull plates together, their small figures moving like ants across vessels that grew larger by the hour. The latest production report. "Admiral," his aide commander Sarah Torres said as she handed him a data tablet. "We have completed our 300th warship this morning." Chun took the tablet and stared at the numbers, still unable to believe what his species had accomplished in such a short time. 6 months ago, they had 47 ships, and most military experts believed it would take a decade to double that number. Now they had 300. And the projections suggested they would have 2,000 by the end of the year. "How is this possible?" he asked. Though he already knew the answer, Torres smiled grimly as she gestured toward the vast industrial complex spreading across the Martian surface below. "Every factory on Earth has been converted to military production," she explained. "Every university has shifted to weapons research. Every mining operation is running triple shifts. And every citizen who can work is working." She paused and looked out at the ships taking shape around them. "They call it the Great Mobilization, Admiral. and it is the largest industrial effort in human history. Chun nodded slowly as he remembered the day the news arrived that the conclave had abandoned them. He had expected despair, expected riots, expected his people to fall into chaos as they realized they stood alone against an empire of 4,000 warships. Instead, he had witnessed something that made his heart swell with pride. Humanity had not broken. Humanity had gotten angry within hours of Elena's broadcast reaching Earth. Volunteers had flooded every military recruitment center on the planet. So many that the centers could not process them all within days. Factories that had produced consumer electronics began producing missile components. And car manufacturers started building tank chassis within weeks. RETIRED engineers returned to work. Students abandoned their studies to join research teams. And children collected scrap metal in the streets. The phrase had spread across human space like wildfire. Repeated in 1,000 languages on 100 worlds. Fine. We will do it ourselves. It was printed on posters, painted on walls, tattooed on skin, and whispered as a prayer before sleeping. Admiral Chun had served in the military for 30 years. And he had never seen anything like the fury that now burned in the hearts of his people. What about the new weapons programs? He asked as he scrolled through the reports. How are they progressing? Torres pulled up another display showing blueprints and test results that would have seemed like science fiction just a year ago. The Antimatter Warhead Project has completed its first successful test, she reported. Dr. Yamamoto believes we can begin mass production within 2 months. The kinetic kill vehicle program has exceeded all expectations, achieving velocities of 0.3 light speed in controlled tests. And the Electronic Warfare Division has cracked Vec3 communication encryption, which means we can now turn their ships against each other. Chun felt a cold satisfaction spreading through his chest as he considered the weapons his people were creating. The galaxy had assumed humans were weak, that they were a young species barely worthy of notice. They had no idea that humanity had spent its entire history preparing for war, that every generation had fought and died in conflicts that shaped their very nature. War was in their blood, in their bones, in the deepest parts of their souls. They had simply learned to hide it behind smiles and diplomacy, because the galaxy seemed to want peace. Now the mask was off, and the universe was about to see what humans really were. What are the Vec3 doing? Chen asked as he turned away from the production reports. Have they noticed what we are building? Torres frowned as she pulled up intelligence summaries from their spy networks deep within enemy space. Their scouts have reported increased activity in our shipyards, she said. But their high command has dismissed the reports as exaggeration or error. They believe it is impossible for any species to mobilize this quickly, and they assume our numbers are inflated by propaganda. Chun laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. They think we are lying about how many ships we have built. Yes, Admiral, Torres confirmed. Their cultural understanding of war is very different from ours, as they fight for territory and resources, but never for revenge or principle. They cannot comprehend a species that would sacrifice everything simply because they are angry. Admiral Chun walked to the window and stared out at the fleet assembling around Mars. Hundreds of vessels bristling with weapons that had not existed 6 months ago. Each ship was crewed by volunteers who had signed up knowing they might die, not for money or glory, but because their brothers and sisters had been murdered and someone had to make the enemy pay. The Vec3 believe war is about calculation, Chun said quietly. They count ships and weapons and resources, and they assume the side with more will always win. He turned back to face his aide with eyes that burned like dying stars. They have never fought a species that views war as a matter of principle rather than profit. They have never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for victory. And they have never, not once in their entire history, encountered humans who have been told they cannot win. Torres nodded and straightened her uniform as she prepared to return to her duties. "What are your orders?" "Admiral." Chun looked once more at the fleet growing around him, at the weapons being forged in the fires of righteous fury, at the civilization that had transformed itself into a war machine in less than half a year. "Continue the build-up," he commanded. "Train the crews, test the weapons, and prepare for the offensive. When we are ready, we will not simply defend ourselves against the Vecturi. We will bring the war to their doorstep, and we will make them understand what it means to awaken a species that has nothing left to lose." He paused and smiled grimly at the stars. "And when we are finished, the galaxy will never again make the mistake of thinking humans are weak." Torres saluted and departed, leaving Chun alone with his thoughts and his anger. Outside the window, the shipyards continued their work, building instruments of destruction at a pace the galaxy had never witnessed. The Vecturi thought they understood war. They were about to learn how wrong they were, and across the vast emptiness of space, on worlds that had never known conflict, the ancient species of the Conclave began to feel something they had not experienced in millennia. They felt afraid because they were starting to realize that they had not simply abandoned humanity to die. They had given birth to something far more dangerous than any enemy they never faced. They had created a species with nothing to lose and everything to prove, and that species was coming for blood. The Battle of Proxima Station was supposed to be a simple slaughter, a demonstration of Vecturi superiority that would crush human resistance once and for all. 800 warships of the Dominion emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their weapons charged and their crews confident in the victory that awaited them. Fleet Commander Vokran stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominance, watching the sensor displays with cold satisfaction as his forces moved into attack position. The humans had gathered 200 ships to defend this station, a pathetic collection of vessels that would burn like paper before his fleet. "All ships report ready for combat," his tactical officer announced. The humans are holding position near the asteroid field, refusing to engage. Vokran made a sound that passed for laughter among his species, a clicking of mandibles that echoed across the bridge. "They know they cannot win," he declared. "They are simply trying to delay the inevitable while their civilians evacuate. Signal all vessels to advance and destroy everything that moves." The Vecturi fleet surged forward like a wave of death, 800 ships moving with the mathematical precision that had made the Dominion masters of 100 star systems. They had fought dozens of species across the centuries, and they had never lost a battle where they held such overwhelming numerical advantage. Today would be no different, or so Vokran believed. Admiral Chun Weilin watched the enemy approach from the bridge of the Defiance, his expression calm despite the impossible odds his fleet faced around him. His crew moved with quiet efficiency, preparing for a battle they knew might be their last. "The Vecturi are entering the asteroid field," Commander Torres reported. "Their formation is beginning to spread as they navigate around the larger rocks." Chun nodded slowly as he studied the tactical display, watching the enemy ships separate from their tight formation. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. "Signal all squadrons," he ordered. "Begin Operation Avalanche across the human fleet." Captains who had spent months preparing for this moment began to move the 200 human ships, suddenly scattered in what appeared to be random directions, breaking apart into groups of 3 and 4 that dove into the asteroid field from every angle. To the Vecturi sensors, it looked like panic, like a prey species fleeing before predators. Commander Vokran watched the humans scatter and felt contempt rising in his chest. "They run like the cowards they are," he announced to his bridge crew. "All ships pursue and destroy. Leave nothing alive." His fleet broke formation completely as individual captains chased the fleeing human vessels. each one eager to claim kills for their personal glory. They had no idea they were being led into a trap. The first warning came when a Vectory destroyer vanished in a flash of antimatter fire, struck by a missile that had been hiding behind an asteroid for 6 hours. Then another ship exploded, and another, and another. The asteroid field came alive with weapons fire as human vessels emerged from hiding places throughout the rocks, having positioned themselves days before the battle began. What is happening? Vakran screamed as his tactical display filled with damage reports. Where are these attacks coming from? His tactical officer worked frantically at his console, trying to make sense of the chaos engulfing their fleet. The humans set an ambush. Commander, they have ships hidden throughout the asteroid field, and they are hitting us from every direction. Vakran stared at the display in disbelief as he watched his fleet tear itself apart, trying to respond to attacks coming from all sides. The mathematical precision of Vectory warfare was useless here, as every optimal response pattern required knowing where the enemy was. And these humans seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the electronic warfare began. Aboard the Vectory cruiser Merciless Strike, the weapons officer suddenly watched his targeting systems lock onto a friendly vessel and fire. "What are you doing?" the captain screamed as their missiles slammed into the ship beside them. "You just killed 200 of our own crew." "I did not do anything," the weapons officer cried out in terror. The computer fired by itself across the Vectory fleet. The same scene repeated as human. The electronic warfare systems took control of enemy weapons and turned them against their masters. Ships that had never been touched by human fire exploded under bombardment from their own allies, their crews dying in confusion and terror. Admiral Chun watched the chaos unfold and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Phase 3, he ordered. "All suicide squadrons, you are cleared to engage priority targets across the battlefield." 50 human pilots in small attack craft heard the order and began their final missions. Lieutenant Maria Santos was one of them, a young woman from New Helsinki who had lost her entire family when the Vectory burned her world. She had volunteered for this mission, knowing she would not survive, and she had recorded a message for her unborn niece explaining why she was willing to die for everyone they killed. She whispered as she pushed her engines to maximum and aimed her ship at the Vectory flagship. "For everyone who will never get justice unless we take it ourselves." Her craft was small and fast, too quick for the larger ship's weapons to track, and she slipped through the defensive fire like a ghost. The Vectory crew saw her coming in the final seconds, saw the human vessel racing toward their bridge with no attempt to evade. "She is going to ram us," someone screamed. "She is not trying to survive, Commander." Vakran stared at the approaching ship and felt something he had never experienced before. He felt fear, not of death, but of an enemy who would throw their lives away without hesitation, who viewed their own survival as secondary to the destruction of their foes. This was not how war was supposed to work. Enemies were supposed to value their own lives, to retreat when the odds turned against them, to surrender when defeat was certain. These humans did none of those things. Maria Santos hit the eternal dominance at 300 kilometers per second, and the flagship of the Vectory fleet vanished in a ball of nuclear fire across the battlefield. 49 other pilots made the same sacrifice, each one taking an enemy carrier or command ship with them into death. Vectory fleet fell into complete chaos as their command structure collapsed and their ships turned against each other under human electronic control. When the battle ended 3 hours later, Admiral Chun stood on his bridge and surveyed the wreckage of an enemy force that had outnumbered him 4-1. Casualty report. He asked quietly, "Commander Torres." Checked her displays with shaking hands. "We lost 62 ships, Admiral." including all 50 Suicide Squadron pilots. She paused and looked up at him with something like awe in her eyes. The Vectory lost 512 ships, including their flagship and 7 carriers. They are retreating in complete disorder, and their remaining vessels are fleeing back to Dominion space. Chung closed his eyes and offered a silent prayer for the brave souls who had given their lives. This day, send a message to Earth, he ordered. Tell them the Battle of Proxima Station is over. Tell them humanity has won across the galaxy. Species who had dismissed humans as weak and primitive watched the battle recordings with growing horror. They saw pilots fly willingly to their deaths. They saw a species fight with fury that defied all logic. They saw a species fight with fury that defied all logic. They saw an enemy that could not be broken by superior numbers or superior firepower, and they understood at last what the Conclave had unleashed when they abandoned humanity to face the Vectory alone. They had awakened something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species that would rather die than surrender. A people who had transformed their rage into a weapon more powerful than any fleet. Humanity had won its first major battle, and they were just getting started. 2 years had passed since the Battle of Proxima Station, and the galaxy had learned to fear a species it once dismissed as insignificant. The resonance floated in the emergency chamber of the Galactic Conclave, its ancient light flickering with emotions it had not felt in 3,000 years around it. The representatives of 100 species sat in stunned silence as the latest intelligence reports played across the holographic displays. Human fleets had pushed deep into Vectory space, conquering or liberating world after world depending on how the inhabitants had treated human prisoners. The dominion that had once threatened to exterminate humanity was now fighting for its very survival. How did this happen? The delegate from the Crystalline Collective demanded, its faceted body refracting the chamber lights into rainbows of confusion. 2 years ago, they had 300 ships, and now our intelligence suggests they have over 6,000. The resonance pulsed with weary acknowledgement of this impossible truth. They have exceeded every projection we made. It admitted their industrial capacity has grown faster than any species in recorded history. But that is not what concerns me most. The chamber fell silent as the ancient being's light grew dim with something that might have been shame. What concerns me is what they have become. The holographic display shifted to show footage captured by Conclave observers positioned throughout the war zone. Human soldiers fought with discipline and precision that would have impressed any military power in the galaxy, clearing enemy positions with ruthless efficiency. But it was not their skill that disturbed the watching delegates. It was their eyes. Every human in the footage had the same look, a cold determination that went beyond ordinary warfare into something primal and terrifying. They were not fighting for territory or resources or political advantage. They were fighting because they had been wronged, and they would not stop until the debt was paid in full. They accept surrenders, the resonance continued. They treat prisoners according to galactic conventions, and they allow civilians to evacuate before attacks. But for every atrocity the Vectory committed against their people, they extract an equal measure of justice. The display showed a Vectory commander being led away in chains. The same commander who had ordered the bombardment of New Helsinki 2 years earlier. They call it the balance, the resonance explained. For every human life the Vectory took, they demand accountability from those responsible. And they have long memories. The delegate from the Harmony Spheres, a collective consciousness that valued peace above all things, spoke with trembling voice. Can we not intervene now? It asked. Can we not force a ceasefire before this war consumes them both? The resonance turned its attention to the smaller being with something that might have been bitter amusement. With what authority? It asked. They withdrew from the conclave when we refused to help them, and they have made clear that any species aiding the Vectari will be treated as an enemy. But surely they would not threaten the elder races. Another delegate protested. We have maintained peace in this galaxy for 6 millennia. Would they not? The resonance replied, and its light flickered with dark certainty. They dared to fight alone against 4,000 ships when they had barely 50. They dared to sacrifice thousands of their own people in suicide attacks against superior forces. They dared to transform their entire civilization into a war machine in less than a year. The ancient being pulsed with an intensity that made several nearby delegates flinch. They are not a species that understands the word impossible, it declared. They simply ignore it and do what needs to be done anyway. The chamber sat in uncomfortable silence as the weight of those words settled over them like a funeral shroud. For 6,000 years, the elder races had maintained peace through careful diplomacy and the threat of overwhelming force. No young species had ever dared to challenge their authority, knowing that the combined might of the ancient powers could crush any rebellion. But humanity had not challenged them. Humanity had simply walked away and handled the problem themselves, and in doing so, they had proven that the elder races were not as essential as they believed. That a species could survive and thrive without their protection or guidance, that was almost more frightening than any military threat. What do they want? Someone finally asked. What will it take to end this war? The resonance considered the question carefully, drawing on reports from countless observers and the whispered fears of 100 species. The Vectari have already approached them with peace offers, it revealed. They have offered territory, reparations, even formal apologies for their actions, and the humans refused. The delegate from the merchant coalition leaned forward with interest. They refused reparations, it asked with disbelief. What more could they possibly want? Justice. The resonance replied simply. They want those responsible for the deaths of their people to face judgment. Every commander who ordered attacks on civilian populations. Every soldier who participated in atrocities. Every politician who voted to continue the war when peaceful options existed. They have lists, detailed records of every crime committed against them. And they will not stop until every name on those lists has been crossed off. Horror rippled through the chamber as the delegates understood what this meant. The humans were not fighting a war of conquest or even a war of survival. They were fighting a war of vengeance. Patient and methodical and utterly implacable. We could have stopped this. The delegate from the Wisdom Keepers said quietly, its voice heavy with regret. If we had intervened 2 years ago when they asked for help, if we had treated them as equals rather than children to be ignored, the resonance pulsed in agreement. Its ancient light dim with shame. Yes, it admitted. We could have saved millions of lives on both sides if we had simply done what was right. But we did not. And now we must live with the consequences of our inaction. It turned its attention to the vast window overlooking the stars, contemplating the fleet of human warships that had been spotted just 3 systems away. They will win this war, the resonance declared with absolute certainty. The Vectari cannot match their production capacity or their willingness to sacrifice. And when they have finished with the Dominion, it paused. And every being in the chamber felt the weight of what was coming. They will remember who abandoned them in their hour of need. They will remember who stood aside and watched while their children burned. And we will have to hope that their sense of justice includes mercy for those who simply did nothing while evil prevailed. The chamber remained silent long after the resonance finished speaking outside. In the cold darkness between stars, human fleets continued their advance, bringing the war ever closer to the heart of Vectari space and across the galaxy. In palaces and councils and command centers that had stood for millennia, The powerful began to understand a truth they had always known but never admitted. Peace was not a right. It was a privilege that had to be earned and defended, and humanity was about to teach the galaxy that lesson in fire and blood. The celestial armies that had maintained order for 6,000 years looked upon the advancing human fleets and felt something they had forgotten existed. They felt afraid because they knew that when this war ended, nothing would ever be the same again. The balance of power that had existed for millennia was shattering, and humanity would be there to pick up the pieces. The Treaty of Seoul was signed on a beautiful spring morning in the shadow of the United Nations building. Rebuilt from the ashes of victory bombardment as a monument to human defiance, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the podium. Her hair now streaked with gray, and her eyes carrying the weight of 3 years of war behind her. Thousands of human citizens filled the plaza, their faces a mixture of triumph and grief as they witnessed the end of the bloodiest conflict their species had ever known. The victory delegation knelt before her, their once proud forms bent in surrender as they awaited the terms of their defeat. Fleet Commander Vakran was among them, having survived the destruction of his flagship only to be captured. 6 months later, during the Battle of the Dominion Corps, he had been the one to order the attack on New Helsinki that killed Elena's own sister and her children. Now he knelt at her feet, waiting to learn his fate. The terms of surrender are as follows, Elena announced, her voice carrying across the plaza through thousands of speakers. All victory claims to human territory are permanently revoked, and the Orion Spur shall remain human space until the stars themselves burn out. Full reparations will be paid for every colony destroyed, every life taken, every crime committed against our people. The victory military will be reduced to defensive forces only, with no capacity for offensive operations beyond their own borders, and those responsible for crimes against humanity will face trial before a joint tribunal. She paused and looked down at Vakran, the being who had murdered millions of her people without a moment of hesitation. Justice will be served, she continued, but it will be justice, not vengeance. We will not become the monsters we fought against. Vakran looked up at her with confusion in his alien eyes, unable to understand how a species so capable of destruction could also show restraint. Why? He asked, his voice barely audible. You could destroy us completely, wipe our species from the galaxy, and no one would stop you. Why do you show mercy to those who showed you none? Elena considered the question carefully before responding, aware that her words would echo through history. Because we are not fighting to become the next great tyrants of the galaxy, she said. We are fighting to prove that we are better than those who tried to destroy us. Anyone can kill, Commander Vakran, but it takes true strength to spare a defeated enemy when you have every right to destroy them. That is the difference between your species and mine. She turned away from the victory delegation and faced the massive assembly of diplomats gathered to witness this historic moment. The Galactic Conclave had sent its most senior representatives, including the Resonance itself, who floated at the edge of the plaza with its light dimmed by what might have been shame. Elena walked toward the ancient being, and every eye in the plaza followed her. 2 years ago, I stood before you and begged for help, she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent crowd. I showed you evidence of genocide, of billions of lives being extinguished while you debated the finer points of galactic law. And you told us it was not your problem. The Resonance flickered, but said nothing, so we handled it ourselves. Elena continued. We built fleets that darkened the skies of enemy worlds. We created weapons that would have seemed like magic a decade ago. And we fought until our enemy broke. We did what you said was impossible. And we did it alone. She paused and let her words sink in before continuing. But we learned something in this war that we did not expect to learn. We learned that we are capable of terrible things when pushed, that the fury inside us can turn us into something we do not want to be. We looked into the darkness within ourselves, and it frightened us. The crowd murmured in surprise at this admission of vulnerability from the leader of the species that had just conquered an empire. "So we offer you a choice," Elena declared. Turning to address both the conclave and her own people, "We can take our fleet and go home. Retreat behind our borders and leave the galaxy to sort out its own problems the way you left us. Or we can build something better together." The resonance moved closer, its light brightening with cautious interest. "What do you propose?" it asked. Elena smiled. And for the first time in 3 years, it was not the smile of someone preparing for battle. "A new conclave," she said. "One with real authority to intervene when the innocent are threatened. One that does not hide behind procedure while millions die. Humanity will contribute our ships, our technology, our soldiers, and our fury. But this time that fury will be directed toward justice rather than revenge. You refused to help us when we needed it, but we will not refuse to help others when they cry out for salvation." The resonance considered her words for a long moment, its ancient mind processing the implications of what she was offering. "You would forgive our failure?" it finally asked. "You would work beside those who abandoned you?" Elena shook her head. "Forgiveness takes time," she admitted. "And trust must be rebuilt through actions, not words. But we are willing to try. Because the alternative is a galaxy where the strong prey upon the weak and no one comes to help. We have seen that galaxy, and we reject it." She extended her hand toward the ancient being. "A simple human gesture of partnership. Will you join us in building something better?" The resonance floated in silence as the entire plaza held its breath. Then, slowly, a tendril of light extended from its form to touch Elena's outstretched hand. "We will," it agreed. "And perhaps in doing so, we will finally become worthy of the civilization we have claimed to represent." Cheers erupted across the plaza as humans and aliens alike celebrated this moment of reconciliation. Admiral Chan Wei-Lin stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Commander Torres appeared beside him, her uniform decorated with medals earned in a dozen battles. "Do you think it will work?" she asked. "Can we really build a new order with the species that abandoned us?" Chun considered the question as he watched Elena shake hands with delegates from 100 worlds. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know that we have proven something important to the galaxy today. We have proven that humanity cannot be ignored, cannot be dismissed, cannot be pushed aside when we are inconvenient. And we have proven that we are capable of mercy as well as wrath." He turned to face his loyal second-in-command with a tired smile. "That is enough for now, Commander. The rest we will figure out as we go." Torres nodded and saluted before returning to her duties. Chun remained alone, watching the celebration unfold, remembering all the friends he had lost and the sacrifices that had brought them to this moment. High above the plaza, the fleet that had conquered an empire hung in silent orbit, its weapons finally cold after 3 years of continuous war. They had proven that humanity could not be destroyed. Now they would prove that they could also create and across the galaxy. In chambers of power and corners of darkness, those who had once dismissed humanity as young and weak finally understood the truth. Humans were not to be trifled with, not because they were the strongest, not because they had the most ships, but because when the universe told them something was impossible, they simply said, "Fine, we will do it ourselves," and then they did it. That was the lesson the galaxy would never forget. And that was the legacy humanity would carry among the stars forever. The war was over, but the story was just beginning.